I call the Honourable David Parker.
And I gladly reply. Mr Speaker, I think when accusations are made that the Labor Party is not in favour of a prosperous dairy sector, we should have regard to history. It was the Labor government under Michael Joseph Savage who formed the Dairy Board in its original form, trying to vertically integrate the industry in order that farmers would get a decent slice of the value chain between farm gate and supermarket, or the predecessors of supermarkets back then. Tooley Street buyers. Thank you. It was the Clark government that created Fonterra, and members don't have to have an especially long memory to recall that at that time the merger of the two main dairy co-ops, New Zealand Dairy Group and Kiwi Dairy Cooperative, required the intervention of this Parliament, because otherwise it would have been blocked because of domestic competition concerns under the Commerce Act. And we in this Parliament, led by the then Labor Party, said that we thought that it was in New Zealand's interest that we guard the export interests of New Zealand's dairy industry, which were best met with a strong cooperative that was New Zealand owned, that was vertically integrated and maintained New Zealand ownership of that value chain in the same way that had been the objective of the original Savage legislation in much earlier years. We heard from John Banks at times an entertaining speech talking about how we should be going past the woolshed as we went to see the dairy farmers. He was mixing his metaphors there. I would say to Mr Banks that what we need to watch out for here is that if we don't get this right in this Parliament, it won't be the cows that are getting milked in the future, it'll be the farmers. Because unless they maintain long-term control of the vertically integrated structure that we currently have through Fonterra, they and the New Zealand economy will be worse off. I agree with Mr Banks that that in general terms government should stay out of business. We're not in the process. We're not in the business of business. We should be getting out of the way of business where we're in the way of business. But Mr Speaker, previously Fonterra came to this Parliament and asked for special privileges which they said were in New Zealand's wider interests. Mr Banks, we don't just sit here for the interests of farmers. We don't just sit here for the interests of Fonterra. We sit here for the interests of farmers and Fonterra and the New Zealand public interest. And I didn't hear you once mention the interest of the wider New Zealand public interest. And we believe that that public interest is best preserved if the cooperative structure is preserved into the future. You ask why it is. What is the point of? We ask why it is. What is the point of principle that lies at the heart of our opposition to backing this at first reading? And that is that there is a fundamental flaw in this legislation that should not have been in it when it was introduced. And fundamental flaws ought to be fixed before legislation is introduced. We don't trust that member or the national government to fix this at Select Committee, and that's why we're opposing it. If it's fixed at Select Committee to our satisfaction, we may revise our vote at later readings, but we're not confident, based on the unwillingness of the government to address it until now, that it will be. That point of principle is that if this legislation is passed without any further recourse to Parliament, two things could happen that could lead to the long-term loss of control of the cooperative and the undermining of the cooperative structure and the eventual loss of our vertically integrated dairy sector. And those two steps that would need to be taken don't require any parliamentary intervention at all. The first is that the minister at the day, Mr Carter, the current minister, would have to pass a regulation to say that the new capital rules will apply. Okay? Now, what happens when those new capital rules come into force is that for the first time in our history of this cooperative, the income stream from the cooperative share can be owned by someone else. So the dividend flow from the co-op share At the moment, when you're a milk farmer, for every kilogram or every 1,000 kilograms of milk solids that you deliver to Fonterra, you have to own a co-op share, and you can't sell it to anyone else. Under this legislation, not only will there be able to be trading amongst farmers of shares so that someone can have more shares in the co-op than they deliver milk and someone else can have fewer. That's a big change for a start. But in addition to that, we're creating this new class of shares where the future dividend flow and increases and decreases in value of the share above the value at the date it starts to trade pass to the person who holds the rights on that shares rather than the farmer. And Mr. Banks, you tell me, Mr. Banks, what is the control on that moving to 100% over the time? And I'll tell you the answer to that, because I asked Fonterra, and they told me that it is a provision in the Constitution. So without any recourse to Parliament, the limitation on the number of shares that can be separated from their income flow and are traded on a separate platform can be changed without any recourse to this Parliament, and it could go from their current intention of it being about 5% or 10% to 15% to 20% to 30% to 40%. Now, at which point does the tail start to wag the dog? Well, there are overseas examples of where the separation of profit flow from ownership in a co-op share in the traditional structural sense, where over time the different incentives have resulted in the long-term breakup of the co-op. And I'm told by my colleague Damien O'Connor that that's happened as percentages as low as 20% of the shares being in this different platform. Now, why does this happen? Well, it happens because the holders of different classes of shares have different incentives. The traditional cooperative model is driven by the belief that vertical integration is the long-term driver of profit. Well, you don't have to be a brain surgeon to know that some of the majority of the holders of these shares outside of the traditional co-op share structure in this market, which is trading rights, the rights to dividends and increases in value of the share, their motivation is not necessarily the long-term vertical integration of the dairy industry, which has proven successful in New Zealand. Their interest is in short to medium-term profit. And if they can achieve short to medium-term profit by flogging off part of that vertically enterprise overseas, they will militate for it. And I think it is wrong that legislation is brought to this House where there is no recourse back to Parliament that would allow Parliament to stop that happening. We'd have to be intervening after the Act, and everyone would say, oh, you're interfering with private property rights, compensate us, please. Since this Parliament intervened in favour of Fonterra, that industry has grown to New Zealand's largest exporter. It was already its largest exporter, but it's grown incredibly since. And now I think it's about 22% of all new exports are in the dairy industry. 26%, thank you. 26%, a full quarter. There is a national interest here that goes beyond the Fonterra interest and the farmer interest, and we're not satisfied it's met. One final thing. The shareholder support that there was for this at the time was against the background of the global financial crisis, a run on Fonterra's balance sheet caused by people being under pressure and wanting to get some money out, driven not just by the global financial crisis and the effect on land prices, but also by a drought at the time, and also by the liquidity problems that banks were having and the pressure they were putting upon farmers. We also had the history where Fonterra had not been making retentions towards their own capital costs in the future because they were distributing every cent of profit, and that was a mistake by the then directors of Fonterra, and in fairness to them, they now acknowledge that that was wrong, but they're not stuck with that problem for the future. So the idea that Fonterra is in some dire position because this legislation does not pass is not accepted. It's got to where it is under its existing structure. It's got through the global financial crisis, that drought and its problems of that time without recourse to the structure, and although it might want it, it's not going to bring it to its knees if it doesn't get it. Mr. Speaker, this legislation does not include essential protections. It is absolutely shoddy practice on the part of the Minister, not even to mention the facts that I have canvassed about how this could change over time without further recourse to Parliament to stop the growth in these trading shares outside of the traditional co-op structure, and that is the principal reason why I am objecting at this stage to this legislation.
I call the honourable member Stephen Browning.